Good afternoon and welcome to the Respectability webinar for June 23rd, 2021. My name is Philip Kahn-Polly. I am the Policy and Practices Director for Respectability, and I am so delighted that all of our audience members are joining us today. I'm so delighted to have Pete and Meg and Frank joining us to talk about the state of disability employee engagement. Just as a quick accessibility note, we are short an ASL interpreter today. I am so sorry. We are trying to track them down and get them online. But for now, we have captioning, which you can enable at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So I just wanted to give you a heads up on that. So as I said, the topic today is the state of disability employee engagement. And I'm brought together today some really world-class leaders on the issues of disability employment, inclusion, equity, and corporate hiring. The wonderful folks at Global Disability Inclusion and Mercer have recently published a really groundbreaking report. And I don't use those words lightly. I read a lot of reports, I write a lot of reports, but there's something really special about this new Mercer report that really digs into some pretty big data sets to really get at the heart of where things stand for employees with disabilities and where things are going. And so we're going to be digging in deep today to really talk about the state of employment for people with disabilities, where best practices are pointing. And I think there's some really valuable lessons to be shared with our partners in the nonprofit sector, leaders in the business community, and even leaders in the public sector, in state and local government who are also trying to hire the best talent possible. And oftentimes the very best talent that you're going to be able to hire are people with disabilities. And so I'm so glad to be here with you today, and I'm going to start sharing my screen and bring up our slide deck for the day. And as I mentioned, I am joined today by Meg O'Connell, President of Global Disability Inclusion, and Dr. Pete Bertigliano, Senior Principal at Mercer. And here is their bios. So Meg is the CEO and founder of Global Disability Inclusion. She's an internationally recognized disability employment and inclusion expert with over 25 years of experience in capital management, talent acquisition, performance, inclusion, engagement, marketing, and customer service programs. Her team has worked with some of the world's most recognized brands, and she provides strategic programmatic advice, development, implementation of disability employment plans for global 500 companies, federal contractors seeking to meet their requirements under OFCCP, colleges, universities, nonprofits, and foundations. She is also the winner of many awards, including, but not limited to, the SHRM Innovative Practice Award. And Dr. Pete Bertigliano has over 25 years of experience in external consulting, providing data analysis, interpretation, and recommendations to advance organizations across many different industries. He's been with Mercer since 2007, and during that time, he has really worked with client organizations to drive change through engagement surveys, including onboarding, exiting, 360 surveys, as well as others. He's a trusted advisor to Fortune 500 companies throughout North America, and has the ear of many CEOs and corporate executives. He manages the data analytics group, which maintains the company benchmark database. And he is also on the corporate advisory board for Hofstra University, as well as a member of the Society of Industrial and Organizational Psychology, and has over 90 different publications out in the world. So those are the credentials of my illustrious guests today. We are also going to be joined at the end of this presentation by Franklin Anderson, Respectability's Director of Development and Nonprofit Inclusion efforts. And so how the run of show is going to be is I'm going to turn the wheel over to Meg and Pete, and then they're going to go through their slides. They're going to share some of their key findings with us. And then at that point, we will switch to Q&A section where you can where our lovely audience members can ask their questions to our experts today. Drop them in the chat box, put them in the Q&A box, and we will get to them after we go through these slides. So Meg and Pete, the show is yours.
Great. Thanks, Philip. I appreciate it. Yeah, let's go to the next slide and we'll jump right in. So if you guys have joined this call, you obviously have an interest in disability inclusion, and we know diversity, equity, inclusion are the forefront of all talent management strategies for every organization around the globe. And you also likely know that DEI readily focuses on race, ethnicity, gender, age, and sexual orientation. And with 2020, we saw a significant focus on racial equity and justice. Yet, even with all these discussions and knowing that talent management strategies have a large focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, disability is still all too frequently left out of the broader diversity and inclusion conversation. So that's what we're here to talk about today, why that is, what we're seeing, and what we're seeing about the employment experiences of people with disabilities. So next slide, please. So people with disabilities are the largest minority group, representing 15% of the global population. That's a massive number of people. It's 1 billion people worldwide, 15% globally. And in the US, it's 26% of our population. So there's 61 million people in the United States with a disability. And about half of those, 33 million, are working age Americans with disabilities. And then if you look at, because we often hear the statistic of everyone's aging into disability, we will all, if you don't have a disabling condition currently, you will have one at some point in your life. So these last two statistics are really telling, because we know that disability is not just an aging issue, it is an issue that affects all ages. So we have 785 million persons 15 years or older that live with a disability. And then 5% of children from in utero to age 14 have a disability, and that's 95 million people. So disability is here. It will continue to be a part of the human condition, and we just got to get better and smarter about how to accommodate it and how to ensure equal opportunity for people with disabilities. Next slide. Pete, I'll toss this one over to you because I know this is a lot of Mercer's data.
Yeah, sure. So as Meg had pointed out earlier, while disability is included as part of the diversity conversation, it's not included nearly enough. I am seeing a little bit of an uptick recently, but just looking at our data here. So this is looking at a span of data from about 2007 to about 2015. And as part of the work I do, as Phil had brought up earlier, part of my job is to do surveys of organizations. I do engagement surveys, exit surveys, D&I surveys, pretty much the word surveys there, I've done it. And as the benchmark database keeper, I started noticing this pattern that when I looked at the data on the left-hand side, about 90% of companies would investigate differences by gender. They would include it as part of their survey, and then on the back end, we do a certain amount of analyses looking at the comparisons between the groups. We found about 75% of the companies we worked with did some sort of racial or ethnic diversity analysis. Now, it varies across the world. Most of the work had been previously just in the United States, although that has been opening up. But if you look at these numbers, 90% and 75%, those are really big numbers of people that are really investigating diversity differences. Unfortunately, looking at the exact same database, only about 4% of the companies that we were working with at the time even investigated disability as a diversity segment. And that in and of itself was really very discouraging for me, because when you think about what percentage of the people in the United States and also the globe that we're not even investigating, it was really disheartening.
Yeah, it's such a great point, Pete. And it goes back to what we often say is that disability is often the forgotten diversity segment. So we know disability is massive in numbers, but when we think about corporations, corporate America and corporations around the globe, they have not viewed disability as part of their talent strategies, as part of their marketing strategies. Disability has very much been bucketed into charitable endeavors, part of their corporate giving, but not as part of their talent strategies and solutions. So it has been viewed as it's a government problem, it's a nonprofit problem, it's someone else's issue to address, not one that we should be looking at internally within our organization, as well as how do we market to people with disabilities. So we're hoping to change the tide on this.
Yep. Now, the good news is the tide is beginning to change. I remember when we first started doing this, I'd say, oh, and you're going to do some diversity analysis. Oh, yeah, we'll look into race and gender. And then I said, oh, and disability as well. And, oh, yeah, disability as well. Now at least they know it's part of the list that we want to do investigative work with. But since section
503.
What's that?
503.
Yeah, since section 503 came out, we have been seeing a small uptick in the number of companies that are really investigating it. So that's been really exciting. It's slow going and not nearly as many as I would like, but at least it's moving in the right direction. So why don't we go on to the next slide? So over time, I was collecting data as part of my benchmark duties, and Meg has really helped a lot in analyzing and understanding these data over the years. So give you guys a feel for this. These data represent 10 years of data from the years 2008 to 2018. And it represents 12 million employee voices. So we're talking a lot of data here. Just so you guys have an idea of the benchmarks, the data is roughly around 60% US, but we do have some international populations in here as well. So just looking at the data, when we investigated some of the differences, we did find some really large differences. So on the left-hand side, I have the freedom to use my judgment in getting my job done. For those without disabilities, we found on average around 86% favorable, whereas on the right-hand side, you're seeing employees with a disability at 73%. There's a 13-point difference between those two groups. And then on the right-hand side, employees can express their ideas and views without negative consequences. We found a 12-point difference between those without disabilities and those with a disability. And these are pretty strong differences between groups. And if you think about what the words of those questions mean, right? I have the freedom to use my judgment. Well, that means you guys trust me to do my job. Or can I express my ideas and views without negative consequences? Do I feel like I belong in the company? Do I feel like I can speak my mind in the company? And we're finding really stark differences between these groups. Meg, do you want to add anything to this before I go on to the next one?
No, just that, these are really big numbers, and we're going to talk about the significance of these numbers as we go forward. But it is important to note as we get through this, we'll talk about some areas where the differences are much less, but in no instance did people with disabilities rate their experience better than their non-disabled colleagues. So that is also a stark reality for us to face.
Yeah, out of 84 questions, there was not one question where people with disabilities scored higher than those without disabilities. And as a statistician, that really bothered me because just through chance, I should have found at least one or two questions where it flipped the other way, but that wasn't the case.
Yeah.
So when I first started doing this analysis and I saw these differences, I really started thinking, wait a minute, why is it that more companies aren't looking into this? And when you look at these really large differences, and we'll talk about other differences, I'm like, wait a minute, we're seeing these huge differences. How come people aren't investigating this? And the problem was, well, they didn't know what they didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
So let's move on to the next slide. Thanks, Bill. We did find some other differences as well. So on the left-hand side, I receive recognition from management when I do a good job. There's a large discrepancy there, another 12-point difference between those with and those without disabilities. And then this question on the right-hand side, and I see this as being one of the most important of the 4 questions that we're talking about here. My company takes an interest in the well-being of its employees. There's a 9-point difference between those with disabilities and those without, right? So a good way of thinking about this, roughly around 3/4 of the people without a disability feel like my company takes a genuine interest in me. But we're only seeing about 60% for employees with a disability, right? They're not feeling as valued in the company. And that's why I think this is one of the most important of the last 4 questions. If I don't feel valued, how am I going to feel connected to my organization? And what does that say about how I feel about myself? And over time, if you don't feel valued in an organization, you're much more likely to move on. You're not going to want to stay there. So let's move on to the next slide. So the next two, though, are showing where we're seeing less of a strong difference, right? The other ones were between 9 and 13%, which are, by the way, huge differences. We typically don't see that. We'll talk to that a little bit later. But there are areas where we're not seeing as much of a difference. So on the right-hand side, I am treated with respect and dignity at work. There's still a 5-point difference there, but it's not as bad. So the good news is, all right, I may not necessarily be valued, and people typically interpret that as valued for my contribution. That means my contribution to the company is not as valued as someone else. Whereas this one is more about respect and dignity, right? This is basically table stakes. Before I feel valued, I first have to be respected. And we do see a bit of a difference there. Again, it's only 5 points, but at least it's better than we're seeing some of the other questions. The other thing on the right-hand side, the amount of work expected of me is reasonable. People with disabilities are feeling like the amount of work that they're experiencing is a little bit less reasonable than those without a disability. Now, there's a bunch of different ways we can unpack that and think about this. But Meg, do you want to add anything to that before I move on?
No, just the point that, in the earlier slides, we saw that people with disabilities don't feel they're allowed to make decisions about their work. They feel that it's very prescribed. They also feel that their workload is greater than their non-disabled colleagues. So likely, as we interpret that, that means, people with disabilities get very prescribed activities to do and then get a lot of them. So they're not being asked to be really thoughtful or strategic. It's very kind of repetitive activities where there's very specific instructions, and they're not really being asked to be thoughtful and strategic. And so, everybody wants to feel that their opinions are valued and that they can add something meaningful to whatever project. Not every project's exciting. We all know that, right? But everybody wants to feel like they have an opportunity to add something meaningful to whatever it is that they're working on. And we're just not seeing that.
And actually, let me add a little bit more to that. And Meg's, your points are spot on. Keep in mind that the people who are answering this are those who have an apparent or non-apparent disability, right? So there's the whole breadth of disabled individuals in this database. So there could be an aspect of this that maybe certain activities are a little bit harder for certain populations of people. So it feels like there's a less reasonable amount of work being placed on that. But that's something to also consider.
Yep.
Meg, do you want to take the next slide?
Yeah, I'll take that. So this is another slide that had, little differences, but still significant. So the first one on the left, I feel my career goals can be met at my company. People without disabilities rated that 71%, people with disabilities rated at 64%. So a 7 percentage point difference. This is concerning, right? We all want to feel we have an opportunity to grow and develop and take on additional responsibilities. And, people with disabilities often feel stuck in their roles, that they can't really advance and move, whether it's laterally to learn different skills or even, vertically, that they can move up and advance and manage people. The question on the right, which showed an 8 percentage point difference. My company's created an environment where people of diverse backgrounds can succeed. This is really telling, right? I mean, people interpret the diverse backgrounds as part of whatever diversity group that they are a member of. So employees without disabilities rated this 85%, and employees with disabilities rated this 77%. So as a whole, pretty good scores in general, but we're still seeing it's an 8 percentage point gap. So people with disabilities, again, don't feel that their company is creating an environment where they're truly respected and valued and that they can succeed. So again, something that we really need to be mindful of and understand what's what are the underlying causes of that in individual companies?
Yeah.
Pete, you want to add?
Yeah, there is one thing I will add to that, and that the fact is that we see smaller differences in more of the local environment. So typically the questions around how my manager feels about me and how my manager treats me, those differences tend to be a little bit less. And the differences that we see that are more global, right, about the company, about my environment, about leadership, we then tend to see larger differences there. And I think that's part of an important part of the story there, because it has to do with disclosure. Before 503, we were in this don't ask, don't tell kind of environment. And because of that, that meant I was less able to be myself at work, that we didn't want to know about that. And that created some of that distance. But I was more likely to disclose myself to my local environment and my manager. And that's why we saw smaller scores there. And I think that's an important part and an important distinction of the data.
Yep. Yep. We can go to the next slide, Philip. So these differences are really meaningful, right? You know, typically a call to action is a 5 percentage point difference. And what you have seen is only in one question that we shared, there was only a 5 percentage points difference. We saw 12, 13%, 9, 10, you know, really high percentages. And we know that companies spend tens of hundreds of thousands of dollars when there's a disparity between groups, even if it's just gender, that if men scored 5 percentage points higher than women, companies rally around what do we need to do to increase satisfaction and engagement for our female employees. And so when we see differences like we are seeing with people with disabilities compared to those without, it should be a significant call to action for companies to understand what is happening within their four walls. The great thing about this is it's such an incredible opportunity for companies to have a significant impact on their climate and their culture. We know when you design for disability, when you create programs, products, services for people with disabilities, they are good for everybody. Everyone benefits from them, whether it's closed captioning that we're using on our screen, whether it's curb cuts, automatic doors, various accessibility features, digital accessibility features that we all use now. These are good for everybody. And so the significant opportunity here is really remarkable, because if companies start addressing the 15 to 20% of their employee population, we know it will have a significant and positive impact on the rest of the population as well. Pete, anything you want to add on this?
Yeah, and it's really, I'm going to speak a little bit to the top right. I was really surprised about this. And like I told you guys, I'm a data geek, right? I'm a statistician. So I'd been looking at these data for quite a long time. And to see the large differences that I was seeing for employees with disabilities and not seeing as much of a difference in some of these other groups, it really was surprising. Now, by the way, just so you guys are aware, I will see differences by age and by race and by gender and sexual orientation, but I won't see it across the board like I do for employees with disability. And there's a very stark difference in overall engagement that I see for people with disabilities and not the other groups. Yet I do not know any company that I'm working with that doesn't have a plan to work on gender differences or doesn't have a plan to work on racial differences.
Yeah, and almost no company has a plan to address disability differences. So.
Right.
Yeah. All right, Philip, we can go to the next slide. You know, Pete, and as Pete has said, we've done a lot of analysis on the 12 million data sets over the last 10 years. And a question that pops up constantly is, well, maybe people with disability are just not as happy in general as everybody else. You know, that's a common misconception about people with disabilities. We know that people with disabilities live happy, productive lives. They have families, they buy homes, they, are engaged in their communities. So we know that they are not generally unhappy people. And so when we looked at this from the data of new hires and the employment statistics, new hires with and without disabilities are equally as enthusiastic at the start of their employment. They feel there's opportunity, they feel there's engagement, they feel that they're going to be valued in the workplace. So there's little difference about the perceptions of inclusion and advancement opportunities from the start of employment. However, as employee tenure increases, we begin to see the differences in engagement start to change. And we see that shift where people without disabilities continue to feel more hopeful and valued and that there's opportunity. And people with disabilities, it starts to decrease. And could be the climate and the culture aren't as supportive as they thought when they were joining the organization. Some of the difference that we're seeing, they're not feeling valued. They don't feel their opportunities to succeed. They don't feel the company is equipped to support them in the manner that they need. So we see over time, individuals with disabilities being less optimistic and in fact, less engaged, where that is not, they come in at an equal playing field when they first start with an organization. So Pete, anything you want to add?
Yeah, so that really speaks to the fact that, and I think a lot has to do with what I was saying before about feeling like I belong in the organization, right? If I don't feel like I belong in the organization, I'm going to feel more disconnected. So the problem that we're seeing is that when you start at a certain level, there's this hope that I'll feel like I'll belong. And what happens with most people is, yeah, your scores don't decrease that much because you still feel like you belong. But employees with disabilities are feeling less connected because they don't feel like they're valued and they don't feel like they belong as much in the organization. And that's where we're seeing some of the differences lie.
Yeah, absolutely. We can go to the next slide, Philip. Pete, this is you.
Yeah, can we click one more? It's missing the, there you go. So here's the good news about this. And this is actually really encouraging. The question you're asking yourself now is, well, Pete, can we make a difference here? And the answer is yes, absolutely. And this is just one example I have of client data where we did work with them over time. And when the first year we were working with them, I made the suggestion. I said, listen, why don't we toss disability as one of the demographic groups? And they're like, wow, that's a great idea. Let's add that in. I was really excited about that. So after we measured it, I found this 6-point difference. Now, what's interesting is this difference for overall engagement, the difference is usually around 7 to 8%. So it was slightly better than most of the companies I work with. But the team that I was working with was really, really surprised because just like the rest of my data, they didn't see data differences by gender. They didn't see differences by ethnicity, but they did see this difference by disability. And they were shocked. They said, well, we got to do something about it. So they created a really strong disability inclusion program. It was fantastic. And it really hit home. And what you're seeing here is when we then did the measure in year 2, the scores increased for everyone. There was a whole bunch of things the company did. It wasn't just disability inclusion. But you'll notice that gap was smaller. It was 6 points in time 1, and now it's 4 points in time 2. And then they continued the work, and then they decreased that gap to 3 points. So yeah, as long as we collect data, as long as we investigate this, we can make a difference. And that's one of the things I love about my job. If I give them the data, people tend to take the data and make changes with it. And that's what you're seeing here. So by all means, we can make a difference. And we're starting to see this in a lot of companies, not just the one I'm showing here.
Yeah, it's such an important point, Pete, and we see this all the time and say it all the time, right? You can't, it's both ways. You can't measure what you don't track, so you don't understand where people are, and you can't track what you don't measure. So we really need to understand employees with disabilities, and so we can make forward progress. We can improve the experiences. We can create policies, programs, procedures, training that really address the equity and inclusion discussion that we're having for people with disabilities. So again, I think a remarkable opportunity. And I love this example, Pete, because it really shows the progress that can be made when an organization understands their baseline and how they can begin to address some of the disparities over time.
And I know I've mentioned Section 503 a number of times, but I have to tell you, that's been one of the greatest changes that's happened around this space, because prior to that law being enacted, when I would talk to companies about doing this, a lot of times the lawyers said, whoa, we can't do this. And I'm like, why? And the reason they said is, well, then this becomes discoverable. If it turns out there's a lawsuit with someone who's disabled, now we have data to show that there is a problem in the organization. But since Section 503 came out, the lawyers have started saying, wait a minute, if we're not measuring this, how do we know that we don't have a problem? And maybe by collecting the data, we could figure out, wow, there is a big difference here. Let's do something about it so we don't have a lawsuit on the back end. It's much easier to fix things than worry until you have a problem and then fix it.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
It's a very different conversation now with organizations. It tends to go much more quickly. I also don't tend to have a lot of people giving me pushback when it's international as well. That used to be a bigger issue, and now it's become a lot more open and welcome. And a lot of it actually has to do with some of the social injustices we've seen in 2019 and into 2020. A lot more people and a lot more organizations are really open to this conversation.
Yep. Yeah. And I did see a question in the chat, was our data further broken down into disability type or invisible versus visible disabilities? And unfortunately, it's not. And the reason is because of the time frame that we were assessing, right? It was still the very much the don't ask, don't tell era around disability inclusion. And so it hasn't been until 503 that we've been having better conversations about disability disclosure, self-ID, people, coming out with their disability status to let folks know that their disability, and really 503 and the fact that the younger generations grew up with ADA. We're seeing very much a movement from the don't ask, don't tell to being loud and proud, and people not being fearful to come forward. Now, we still have a long way to go, right? It's a cultural shift that happens over time, but we are seeing that movement. And in our future surveys, we are asking an optional question of disability or no disability, and would you be willing to disclose what your disability is? So that data will be forthcoming in our future studies.
Yep. One thing I do want to quickly add to that, consider where a lot of these data come from. They're from my engagement clients, so clients that are doing engagement surveys within the organization. And I only have so much leeway with them. This survey that I've been doing with them is to look at overall engagement of the entire organization. It's not specifically around people with disabilities. So I'm happy to get the one question I do. I'm hoping I could be able to expand it down the road. But actually, that kind of leads to our next conversation. Meg, do we want to move on to the next slide?
Yeah, let's do it. So what Pete is referring to, what can be done, and we have created the first ever disability climate and culture survey. So this will enable companies to really take a deep dive into disability inclusion and what that looks like within their workplace. So this will not take place of the large strategic, or replace the large strategic surveys that go out every year, every 2 years within a company that have, 200 questions on it. What we have seen, and Pete, you can certainly speak to this as well, is that there's a shift in companies really wanting to understand their diversity segments better.
Yeah.
So we're seeing shorter surveys for specific diversity populations, but there has not been one until now focused on disability inclusion. So this will ask disability specific questions. It'll be a shorter survey, about 50, 60 questions. We want responses from people with disabilities and people without disabilities. So at the beginning of the survey, you will be asked, you don't have to give your name, and it's voluntary to give what type of disability, whether it's invisible or visible disabilities. And then, of course, people without disabilities. So the first 35, 40 questions will be the same for everybody. And we'll get those responses. And then if you checked, yes, I'm a person with a disability, you will get disability specific questions around accommodations, self-ID, remote working, workplace safety, all of those things. And if you're a person without a disability, you'll get a set of questions around, do you see your senior leadership discussing disability inclusion in the same way they do other diversity initiatives? Do you feel your colleagues with disabilities are treated with respect and dignity? So you get at both the reality of the experience of people with disabilities and also the perception of the non-disabled colleagues. So we are very excited about the launch of this survey. Those of you that are with organizations that want to dig deep in this, please, feel free to reach out to me or to Pete. You can get information on the Global Disability Inclusion website about Amplify. The survey will run this fall, September 2nd to September 17th, so a 3-week period. And we chose that timeframe because organizations can get results by October, which of course we all know is Disability Employment Awareness Month. And it will enable organizations to have data that will help fuel their strategic planning for not just 2022, but beyond. Yeah. So we're really excited about this. Pete, I don't know if there's anything you want to add about Amplify.
Yeah, a couple of quick things. So number one, I'm in the survey business, and I've been seeing a huge uptick in the number of D&I surveys that I'm doing. And what's exciting about it is it used to be like 90% of the companies were US companies. We're starting to see a huge uptick in Canadian companies doing this. We're also starting to see international companies doing this. So out in Europe and also in Asia, I'm starting to see more companies being interested in this. So the time was really right for this. But the reason we're building this survey is, number one, to make an easy way to get into this sort of analyses, right, through a pulse. But the other thing is able to get at a deeper level than we've ever been able to do. The one question someone asked, and we get that question every time, which is, wow, did you break it out by invisible versus visible disabilities? And the problem is, no, I haven't been able to do that. And this will be my opportunity to finally collect that data and do that analysis. So that's why I'm very, very excited about this.
Yes. And we'll also get further detail if people choose to disclose their disability type. Do people feel, we know by the nature of our work that there are people that are comfortable with certain types of disabilities, and other types of disabilities make them very uncomfortable. So what kind of disparities are we seeing across disability type within the workplace? So this is going to be really valuable, not just for the individual companies that are taking the surveys and getting that data, which will be hugely beneficial, but for the disability field as a whole to get better data about disability types and accommodations and how those disabilities are treated within the workplace. So it's going to fuel better data across the board for all of us.
Absolutely.
So Philip, I think that's a wrap, right? We're ready for questions and comments.
That is correct. So I will say the comment section is out of control, but I want to bring in one of my star colleagues, Franklin Anderson, to share his perspectives in our conversation and question and answer period now. As I mentioned, Frank is the Director of Development and Inclusive Philanthropy at Respectability. He is passionate about the fight for equal rights and opportunities for all marginalized communities, and his passion in the disability space has really manifested in helping lead our inclusive philanthropy work. And that's exactly why I wanted to bring him into this conversation, because he's helped us with our work on ensuring that in the nonprofit space, in the philanthropy space, that the disability becomes part of the inclusion agenda. So welcome, Frank. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So we've got. Do you want to quickly say hello, Frank?
Sure. Yes, you've done a great introduction, Philip. I think you've really checked all the boxes there. I've been in the nonprofit sector my whole career, and I've spent a lot of time working with philanthropic grant-making organizations as well. So that's where a lot of my expertise comes from. But yeah, thanks, Philip.
All right, so I'm going to dive first into the Q&A box. Then I have a couple questions. Folks who are in our audience, please either drop your question in the chat box or in the dedicated Q&A box. So I'm going to pick up on a question from Michael Hogue, who asked, what are some of the key steps that companies in your case study took to close the gap on employee engagement for employees with disabilities? What are some tangible examples of what they did?
Yeah, Meg, I'll start with that and then you could chime in. So the biggest thing was simply drawing it to people's attention. After I do any sort of engagement, I'll do a presentation to the executives and just point out the data. And it's wonderful because pretty much every executive I ever showed that to, they're like, wait a minute, why is there such a big difference there? And then I talk about it. And that tends to just get the ball rolling. Most of the time, when that happens, I'll be connected with usually a diversity inclusion officer of some sort. We'll go into a little bit more detail on where specifically we're seeing the differences. Are they different parts of the organization? What specific questions are we seeing the biggest ones? And then we'll partner up with their employee resource groups or affinity groups or whatnot to really take decisive action around it. A lot of it has been around simple awareness, also giving people the ability to identify in their HRIS system has been really, really positive. Just having that conversation has really moved the dial quite a bit. Meg, you probably have some more stuff.
Yeah, the first piece, you're exactly right, Pete, is that awareness raising, understanding that there's a problem. So we see diversity councils having impact and diversity teams having the awareness of, wow, we need to now be focusing on disability as part of our overall diversity initiatives. We see employee resource groups or business resource groups gaining additional power and presence within the organization to really get to that perspective or share their perspectives with the company as a whole. And then just a good old-fashioned audit of your policies, programs, procedures at the different touch points where employees are touched by the company. Are we able to support and touch employees with disabilities in the same meaningful way that we do other diversity groups? So those are some of the tangible things that we see companies doing a lot of that are making that forward motion and progress.
Wonderful. Thank you, Meg. Thank you, Peter. All right. So Frank, so, you and I have worked on respectability projects together for a long time. And we've really found that, even as nonprofits are making commitments around diversity, equity, inclusion, disability lags behind. And so I'm curious from your perspective, Frank, really what can advocates and what can leaders do to really push the nonprofit sector itself to become more inclusive in our work?
Yeah, thank you, Philip. And to your point, in Respectability's own study of disability inclusion in the social sector, we found that only 23% of organizations are being intentional in recruiting people with disabilities to their organization, which is far, far lower than for other demographic groups. So before you can even start adopting those other best practices, make sure you're being, intentional about welcoming people with disabilities into your organization. Then see if your organization is actually measuring that data. Are they measuring the number of people with disabilities on your staff? And if you're a nonprofit, are you measuring the number of people with disabilities that you serve? So that way you have a baseline understanding of what you need to improve and how you can be more representative of the community that you're serving. And, once you've done those larger scale things, I think that the next step is doing the things that seem small, but can actually help your organization become far more accessible and far more inclusive for people with disabilities. And those things are often making all your online documents and resources accessible, digitally accessible as well. Unfortunately, only 14% of organizations in our study said they always put captions on their videos. And again, this is social sector organizations, nonprofits, foundations, government agencies. So these are professional do-gooders, but only 14% are always putting captions on their videos. So many more need to do that. And just other best practices are things like making sure your job applications are fully accessible. Make sure that your documents are screen reader accessible. And one that I think is really important is including people with disabilities in your marketing materials. Again, referencing our own survey data, only 38% of organizations say that they currently do that. So increasing that would be a big signal to people with disabilities that they'd be welcome at your organization and they'd be included and are welcome to be a part of the team as well as being served by them.
Yeah.
Right. I just want to interject, Frank, because this is one thing that's cropped up a lot in the chat box is you're going to be able to download an accessible copy of these PowerPoint slides, as well as you'll be able to get access a video recording of this webinar on Respectability's website. And as I shared with Pete and Meg earlier, we hope you will share this message for Mercer and Global Disability Inclusion far and wide. All right, and then we're going to go back to the Q&A box. Stephanie,
real quick, Phil, I
yes,
just
Pete.
wanted to add one thing, and Frank, I think your comments were really spot on. I noticed with organizations, when they start a disability inclusion program, it typically starts with first raising awareness, right? Gathering some data, figuring out what they don't know. Then from there, they'll start creating a lot of words around disability inclusion. And then frequently at that point, when I start collecting the data again, it'll be that they feel like the company is talking the talk, but aren't yet walking the walk. And then once companies go to that next phase, that's when we really start seeing some major changes there. So if you guys are early on in your evolution of your disability inclusion program, don't be too discouraged if at the beginning it's just a lot, it feels like lip service. You have to start the lip service before we actually evidence change.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for that, Pete. So I was going to say for the Q&A box, Stephanie Enyart had a question about have you completed IRB for the September survey? And then secondly, are you considering mapping the types of disability that the federal government counts so that you have another point of comparison?
So I'll speak to the IRB because we're not a university. We don't need IRB approval. So, and I'm the head of research, so I feel pretty good about our ability to do that. So the survey is actually pretty much done. There's a little bit of tweaking that Meg and I are doing. We've been socializing it with various groups and getting some feedback, and we've been making some minor changes to it. So I think we're very much in a good place with that. For the second part of the question, Meg, are you able to answer the second part?
Yeah, we are going to do, and it's a good point. The idea is in the disability demographic, we're going to use the broader categories of mobility, disability, neurological, intellectual, developmental, learning disability. So the bigger buckets, vision, hearing, all of that. And then there will be an option if folks want to describe it in more detail. So that's the approach that we currently have now. Certainly, it's a good point to reference what the federal government is using and see where we have an opportunity to make some additions or some changes before we launch.
Yep.
Great. Thank you. All right, and so this next question is coming from me, and it's directed to Meg and to Frank. So, both of you have a lot of experience around, leading nonprofits and really advancing the disability employment space. But I'm really curious, what do you think makes the biggest difference for, making that leap from, just talking to a company or a nonprofit about why disability is important, and how do you get them to really embrace it, and how do you make that change happen? So, Meg, let's start with you.
Yeah, the light bulb turns on at different times for different people, right? And I think it's really helping both nonprofits and for-profit sector really understand the business benefits of disability inclusion, that it's not just a nice thing to do. It's not just the right thing to do. Yes, it is both of those things, but the business benefits and the positive impact to the bottom line disability inclusion has to the organization. And I think as you talk to senior leaders within companies and educate them on that, they see the opportunity. So that would be the first step. The second step is having a deliberate and committed approach to disability inclusion. So assigning someone who's going to lead it. It can't be, it's kind of like, you know, when I'll use a Florida example, since I live in Florida, you know, when they say, you know, you've got kids in the pool and there are 100 adults around, you know, if everyone's watching, no one is watching. There has to be somebody dedicated that, you know, in 15-minute intervals or whatever, make sure that someone is watching the kids and making sure that they're safe. Same thing for your disability inclusion effort. If you have 100 different things happening and everybody's responsible for a little piece of it, but no one's, you know, steering the ship and where it needs to go, that's going to be a miss, and you're not going to have that deliberate and dedicated approach to disability inclusion.
Yeah, and I'll even add one more piece to that. I find in organizations, and this isn't just true for disability, but any diversity group, the more you have an executive sponsor who's connected to it, and ideally an executive sponsor who has a disability, the better it'll be implemented within the organization, because people could tie what we're doing to that specific person. Sometimes when you say, oh, people with disabilities, it feels very far away for people without disabilities, right? My goal is to make sure it's part of everyone's conversation. And I see that in organizations. If I have a senior leader who's Black, I'll see much better scores around diversity inclusion for Black employees. If I have a senior leader who's gay, then I'll see much stronger scores for people within the organization who happen to be gay or lesbian. So having someone identified in the senior group who has a disability works wonders for helping people connect the dots between what we're doing, why we're doing it, and the impact it has at an individual person level. And I've seen that very consistently within groups.
Gotcha. Thank you, Pete. And Frank.
Yeah, and you know, this is often where I start. I just like to start off by saying that working with and managing people with disabilities isn't necessarily always that much different than managing or working with anyone else. You know, to be a successful manager of anybody, you need to ask employees things like, what do we need for you to succeed in this job? What can we provide to you to help you succeed? How can we work more efficiently as a team? So making sure your leadership is asking those questions regularly will yield better results for people, employees with disabilities, as well as employees without disabilities. And it helps get to those answers that can help those people with disabilities on your staff, you know, get the things they need to succeed. And, you know, beyond that, I think often the simple answer is the best answer. Once you do have people with disabilities on your team and, you know, they feel welcomed, included, they feel like they can speak up, they know the solutions that work best for them. They've been working with a disability their entire career. You can trust them to come up with the right solutions and think creatively. So I think disability employee resource groups, ERGs, I think they're a great idea. I think, you know, just finding ways to solicit that feedback is, again, good all around for your company or your organization, but also great at getting that specific feedback that can help your employees with disabilities too.
Yeah.
Fantastic, Frank. We had a question from Joanne Fluke, who was one of our audience members, about whether there are people with disabilities who go in and talk to corporations about including disability in their agendas. And I will just give a quick shameless plug that Respectability maintains a very active speakers bureau where we are supporting and recruiting, you know, diverse people with disabilities to, you know, set themselves up as those, you know, pinch hitters that can go in and talk to an ERG or talk to a company or advise in some kind of consulting capacity. So check out Respectability's website for that. So just shameless plug if you don't mind. But I want to bring up I want to bring up a question from a former Respectability Fellow that's directed to Meg. This is from Chiniri Ezeki, who's a recent graduate and a recent alumni of Respectability's Fellowship Program. And Chiniri would like to know, Meg, how does Global Disability Inclusion support organizations that drive disability inclusion in the workplace?
Yeah, great question. We do a lot of strategy work. So a lot of times companies will come to us and say, we don't know where to start. So for us, it begins with, an assessment, understanding where they are. I've got an HR and recruiting background, and I also ran an employee resource group for a major Fortune 500 company for 4 years. So we started that assessment of looking at the policies, the programs, procedures, and then we do strategic planning with the organization. Here's what you're currently doing. Here's what are some best practices, and let's talk about where you want to go. Where do you want to be a year from now? Where do you want to be 5 years from now? And we create a strategic plan for them that will take them on their journey and really create a roadmap to help them get to where they want to be in 3 to 5 years with their disability inclusion efforts. So we have 3 main focus areas, and it's the workplace. So the infrastructure supports, how are you supporting people with disabilities? The workforce, where are you finding your talent? How are you supporting them once they're in the door? And the marketplace. Most companies are B2C. So what are you doing to market to people with disabilities to understand what their needs are? How are you supporting them with your customer service initiative? So we really try to look at it from a holistic approach. Every company is a little bit different. So we do customize our approaches based on what the company needs. But in a nutshell, it's that assessment, that strategy, and really creating an implementation plan for them.
Great. No, I think that's a great perspective on. Thank you for getting us filled in on your work. So last Q&A box was from Stephen McNeil, who talked about the 4 phases of recruitment and hiring human resources, and how organizations are often successful in phase 1 and phase 2, where you recruit, you onboard, and you train your employees, but they fall short in phase 3, where it's advancements and promotions, and then in phase 4, where an employee leaves the organization. So I'm curious, what do you think companies can do to change course between, onboarding, training, and then giving employees with disabilities opportunities to advance and become leaders?
Yeah, and we saw that in our data, right? That employees with disabilities start with the same level of enthusiasm and energy when starting with an organization. So, the recruiting, the onboarding, all of that's pretty much a well-oiled machine in most companies. It's a defined process for how to get people in the door. Where it starts to lose steam is that individual moving on to a different department. You have different managers, different expectations, different experiences. So, and I would completely agree with you, Stephen. This is where, organizations lose steam, because there isn't as much structure. There isn't as much information around training for employees with disabilities, how to have better conversations, even how to support people within the various departments. There's a lot of inconsistencies in approach about that. So I think as we work with companies, we really try to take some of the guesswork out for individual managers, so they know where to go for their various supports and how to support people with disabilities in the workplaces. So a lot of work to be done in that space, but I am seeing good progress, which is the positive note on that.
Gotcha. So I know we're running out of time, but I want to ask one final question for all 3 of you. And let's go Frank, Pete, and then Meg. And my question to you is, what do you see as being kind of the companies, the nonprofits, or the foundations that are really at the forefront of this work and doing, making a critical difference on disability and inclusion issues? So Frank?
Yeah, thanks. So to start and just pick out one example, I think there are many, but I think a great example lately in the field that I work in philanthropy and nonprofits, has been the MacArthur Foundation. Lever for Change, which is an affiliate of MacArthur, has been including questions about being accessible and disability-related questions in all of their grant programs, not disability-specific grants, but just their grant making in general. And they even go so far as to ask questions about accessibility costs and talking about including accessibility in their project budgets. So for all the grant makers and foundations out there, I think that's a great best practice. You know, it's great to make your grantees and potential grantees think about accessibility before they launch the program. That makes it easier. It makes them more likely to succeed. It's cheaper. So I think that's definitely something to emulate. You know, you don't need to form a totally separate grant making area for disability. You're serving people with disabilities no matter what you're doing. By the nature of our, you know, how we're represented in society. We're in every minority group. So you don't need to do something differently. Just include them in your general grant making programs and the general services you do. Yeah, I think that's the best practice that I'd like to see more grant makers emulate.
All right, Pete, Meg, any specific examples you'd like to highlight?
I have one very quick one, and it dovetails what I was speaking about earlier. I was working with this one company, and their results came back, and it was very much we're talking the talk, but not walking the walk. And they took this very, very seriously. And then when I mentioned to them about, you know, can we identify someone in your senior leadership team? Well, there was someone on the senior leadership team who actually came out and disclosed his disability in the meeting. And they said, wow, you know, Tim, it would be great if you would then be the champion for this. And at the beginning, he was a little reticent to do that because he didn't want to necessarily be associated as someone who was disabled. But after some talk about it, he did eventually come out as having a disability and became a bit of a champion for this. And it made a huge difference within the organization. That level of connectivity, and plus also him coming out and disclosing that when he hadn't disclosed it in the past, made a huge difference in the organization. And Meg?
Yeah, I'll just dovetail on that. The better conversations that we can have on disability inclusion, disability status, and being open and welcoming to those conversations and not being put off by them and knowing how to handle them when someone discloses. I have epilepsy, and I've always been open and disclosed, and I often joke, if I had $1 for every time someone told me that their pet had epilepsy, I would be a millionaire at this stage. So get it. They're trying to empathize and show that they have understanding, but not really an appropriate workplace conversation. So know what to say when someone discloses and have those better conversations.
Gotcha. All right. Well, we are practically out of time, and there's some really great questions we didn't get to today from Nakia Sims and Stephen McNeil, and I apologize about that. So, Pete and Meg, plug your pluggables. Where can people find you, and where can people connect with you to bring this work forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you go to the Global Disability Inclusion website, www.globaldisabilityinclusion.com, you can download the report that Pete and I have been referencing. It is on our website. It's downloadable for free. There is information about Amplify on our website. If you want to sign up and learn more, you can send an email to me personally, meg@globaldisabilityinclusion.com, and happy to talk to you and share more information about Amplify and the work we're doing.
Yep. And I'll just point out that I work at Mercer. However, finding me in a company of 50,000 might be a little difficult. So just go to LinkedIn. There aren't a lot of Peter Bertiglianos out there. So just find me and you can reach out to me that way.
Great. And Frank, let's plug your pluggables as well. Where can we find out more about you, and where can we find out more about your incredible leadership around Respectability's inclusive philanthropy work?
So I'd start by going to respectability.org, getting familiar with everything we do. But when you click on the resources tab, if you scroll down, there's a mountain. I can't describe it as anything less than a mountain of resources there for everything we've touched on. You know, it connects to things like Meg was just saying about disability etiquette and having the right conversations, and all of the data and research that I cited earlier comes from our inclusive philanthropy study. So you can find information there and just a lot of details on best practices, things that you can adopt, I should say, and bring to your organization to make you more successful and more accessible.
All right. Well, I wish we had an hour and a half more, because I think we could dig in and change the world, but we're going to have to go and do that, you know, on our own, and we will connect online. We will, we will follow up with everybody. We will make sure you get the slides. We will make sure that you get certification if you are looking for continuing education credits. Again, Peter, Meg, Frank, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, audience members, for your fantastic questions. If we didn't get to you today, please track down our emails and follow up with us. We will keep the conversation going because, inclusion doesn't happen if we don't keep it happening, and disability issues will not advance unless we are all working to ensure that nothing about us without us is a reality and not just a catchphrase. And so with that, we are going to conclude today's webinar. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Philip.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, guys.